This is Dr. John Callahan, and this is the first of the Field Marshal Strategies videos, this one on the Austrian invasion of Bavaria in the spring of 1809, also known as the War of the Fifth Coalition. So, Austria sees an opportunity. This story actually begins a few years earlier in December 1805, when Napoleon humiliated the Habsburgs and the Russians at the Battle of Austerlitz. Austria lost territory, including Dalmatia, the Tyrol, and parts of Poland, and the Austrians wanted revenge. It's that simple. But it was going to take some time for them to have their opportunity. The next year in 1806, the Prussians were humiliated, and by 1807, Prussia and Russia were both knocked out of the war, leaving Napoleon as the undisputed master of Europe. Now, Napoleon had one enemy left, that was England, and to try and defeat England, Napoleon enacted what was called the Continental System. That system aimed to close every port in Europe to British ships and British goods, and he thought therefore he would cripple the British economy. Unfortunately, every country in Europe did not follow the continental system, and Portugal in particular left its ports open. In order to fix that, Napoleon sent an army across Spain into Portugal. They were defeated by the British, but in the meanwhile, Napoleon decided to take control of Spain himself, and in 1808, did just that with a large army. Unfortunately, things didn't go quite the way he planned, and several of his smaller armies were defeated, most notably General Dupont at the Battle of Belen. And ultimately, Napoleon took a large part of the Grande Armée and invaded Spain himself in the fall of 1808, remaining there until January 1809. He did salvage the situation in Spain. However, that series of defeats made some Europeans, particularly the Austrians, think that the time had come to challenge Napoleon for primacy over Europe. Austria wanted to get its own back, reclaim its territory, depose Napoleon, restore the Holy Roman Empire, meaning restore the Habsburgs' rightful place, so they thought, in Germany. So let's talk first about the Austrians and their army. Uh, the Austrians have come a long way since Austerlitz. The Archduke Charles, younger brother of the Emperor Francis, reformed the army and attempted to bring it kicking and screaming into the 19th century. He did succeed in some ways. He established some initiatives that would bear fruit and make the Austrian army better. The biggest problem, though, is that he couldn't overcome the mindset. He couldn't overcome the 18th century mindset of the Austrian generals and the Austrian political and military leadership, and that was going to be critical. But what did he do that worked? Charles established a corps system and a division system. It was the first time that had been done in the Austrian army, permanent divisions and corps, which meant that staff work would be easier. You no longer had to write messages to every single regiment in the army to get them to move. It also helps to increase flexibility and to encourage combined armed actions between the infantry, cavalry, and artillery. As I said, though, Charles was not able to change the mindset and the simple way of thinking of the Austrian generals and their troops. One critical thing, he couldn't make the army move more quickly. The Austrian army was known for being sluggish and slow, and generally covered between 8 to 12 miles a day on a good day. They marched as fast as their wagons could move. And that was a factor that he could not change, but it was going to become a big part of the 1809 campaign. So let's look to the other side, to France and her allies. So 1809, the Grande Armée, which conquered most of Europe, did not exist anymore. Its best elements, most of its best elements, were in Spain, including the Imperial Guard, much of the heavy cavalry, and many of the great generals. What was raised in place to fight Austria was an army that was full of conscripts, that was hastily formed with provisional units from depot battalions, from the barracks, from the conscripts, and they were hastily rushed forward. They just weren't as good as the troops that had marched around Europe before. One notable exception to this was the Third Corps of the Army, also known as the Army of Germany, under Marshal Davout. Uh, Davout was the best tactical general in Europe, bar none, and his corps was the best corps in Europe, bar none. He himself, his troops, his division commanders, they were the absolute best that France had to offer. And it was a good thing because they were going to face the brunt of the Austrian offensive. To the south of Davout's concentration around Nuremberg and Franconia, on the south side of the Danube, was Marshal Lefebvre. He commanded the Bavarian army. The Bavarians were uh, following French doctrine by that point. They had not been forced to send troops to Spain, so the best of their army was home, and they were backed by the Württemberg army, which was a quite proficient army. It was small, led by General Vandamme, the French general. The Württembergers also were not forced to send troops to Spain, so as a result, they had their best and brightest at home, as it were, and were able to answer the call. Now, as you move north in the Confederation of the Rhine, things aren't quite so rosy. The Kingdom of Westphalia, a new polyglot kingdom, which was made up of pieces that were kludged together from the former British Hanover, uh, Brunswick or Braunschweig, which was a Prussian ally, and numerous other dependencies. It was a new kingdom. They weren't quite happy with their lot, and they were ripe for rebellion. In fact, there would be rebellions later on in the campaign. Then you move further east to Saxony. The Saxon army already existed, it just wasn't very good, and it was forming up to support however it would be needed. As you go to the farthest east, you find Poland, and the Polish army was also quite good, but it was also quite small and would have to defend itself against an Austrian invasion. Now, we've talked about the good and the bad of the French army. This slide really is about the good. The French organization into permanent corps and divisions allowed for easy and efficient staff work. It also facilitated the operations of some superior French generals. The troops may not have been the best, but I also already mentioned Davout. This is also the time of Marshal Massena, Marshal Lannes, General Oudinot. These are gifted French commanders. The division commanders were also quite good, not only in Davout's corps, but across the army. So although the manpower might not have been the best, the generals still were. And that was going to be a major factor that would help Napoleon to to react to the Austrian invasion. And Napoleon himself was still at the peak of his powers. He was not showing the sluggishness that would dog him in later years. So you have the Austrians coming and the French preparing to receive. Now, Napoleon, as I mentioned earlier, left Spain in January. He went back to Paris to help create the army and to manage the situation from his seat of power. He attempted to command in Germany from Paris using a technological marvel, the Chappé semaphore system, that allowed him to move messages back and forth from Paris to the front in Bavaria in a relatively short time. Can't say exactly because that time was dictated by the weather, by fog, by daytime and nighttime visibility. So it wasn't perfect, but it allowed Napoleon to have a better sense of understanding of what was happening at the front and to try and exercise command. Now, what would have made things work really well would have been a front leader, a theater leader who could develop his own ideas and commands. Unfortunately, the French did not have that. Marshal Berthier, the chief of staff for Napoleon, was sent forward, and he was receiving Napoleon's orders and sending them forward. Unfortunately, with all those delays and weather problems, the orders got jumbled, but Berthier kept sending them on faithfully anyway and did not attempt to develop his own real feel for what was going on. Bottom line is, he's a staff officer. He wasn't good at field command. And that failure on his part to be able to command almost cost the French the campaign, as the orders that went to the various commanders were jumbled, and eventually the commanders learned that they probably needed to just ignore whatever was coming from imperial headquarters. So this slide leads to the next slide, which is the map that shows how the War of the Fifth Coalition really began. Some of this we've already talked about. The main theater of the war would be Bavaria. There'd be side theaters in Poland. The British also notably agreed to support by an invasion of the Netherlands, or near the border of the Netherlands and France, at Walcheren Island. They thought that might provide a second front and a distraction for Napoleon. And really, it would be a third front because the British were also operating in Spain. So there are two arrows, or two sets of arrows here, the light blue and the dark blue. The light blue arrows reflect what actually happened. The dark blue arrow is a what if, and that what if was what Charles actually wanted to do, which was to advance from Bohemia into central Germany. He thought that that might foment the uprisings in Germany, which are marked by the red burst up in the Kingdom of Westphalia, and it would also put him between Napoleon's armies and potentially allow him to defeat them in detail. It was a inspired strategy. Unfortunately, it would not be followed. Why? Because the conservatives in the Austrian High Military Council, the Auerlich Council, forced Charles to redeploy the main body of his army south of the Danube. That would protect Vienna, which they were afraid of losing, but it would force Charles almost to do exactly what he didn't want to do, which would be just simply push the French border forces back, actually helping Napoleon to consolidate his army by driving his army backwards on their sources of supply while moving away from his sources of supply. The final piece of this is the blocking force facing Illyria and Italy, which would protect Vienna from the south. Okay, 1809, April 9th, the Austrians invade Bavaria. What's critical about this day is actually that it was a week before Napoleon expected the invasion. Napoleon had quite good intelligence, but this time he was caught flat-footed, and Charles stole a march on him, moving the majority of the Austrian army across the border into Bavaria on April 9th, with two corps moving out of Bohemia in an attempt to force Marshal Davout to remain north of the river. Now, problem is, while I just said that Charles stole a march on Napoleon, but he lost his advantage because of the sluggish movement of the Austrian armies. It took them nearly a week to get as far as Landshut, where Marshal Lefebvre had set up his first defensive line. And those two corps under Colivrat and Bellegarde that were north of the river completely failed to catch Davout, allowing him to get south of the river in a place where he could consolidate his forces with Lefebvre, or at least try to. Now, this series of rearguard actions and sort of bumbling by both sides, the French bumbling because of bad orders from Berthier, the Austrians sort of bumbling forward because they simply were not motivated to move quickly, gets us up to the 16th and 17th of April. But there's one other character we have to track, and that's Napoleon Bonaparte himself. He was surprised by the Austrian invasion, but he quickly wrapped up his affairs in Paris, and on the 13th of April he left, reaching Berthier in Bavaria by the 17th after one of those epic Napoleonic, what can only be described as a hell ride, where he slept little and rode a lot and spent a lot of time in his carriage nonstop, but he got to the front on the 17th. The day before, Lefebvre had been pushed out of Landshut and driven back, and Davout, who had passed through Regensburg, was trapped in a bend of the Danube. Now that's shown in the following map, and that map is going to be the end of this presentation, which is the introduction and background of the Austrian invasion of Bavaria. So you can see that Charles actually has achieved a central position between Davout and Lefebvre. Napoleon is coming up. Massena, Oudinot are coming. Vandamme is coming. You can't see that on this map, but he's coming from off map. It's just a question of who's going to move quickly or more quickly, who's going to strike first with the hardest force. So I want to thank you for listening to this presentation. I want to refer everyone to the excellent trilogy Thunder on the Danube by James Gill. It's the best source for understanding this campaign, and also combines with his work with Eagles to Glory, another book which covers the French allies and their role in the campaign. You also have Gunther Rautenberg's Napoleon's Greatest Adversary, which discusses specifically the Archduke Charles, and then of course David Chandler's Campaigns of Napoleon, which remains the core work on the period. So I'm leaving you here with my two email addresses, Dr. J. Cal and then John at TFM Strategies. Please reach out to me. I want to know if I've said something wrong, if I could say something better, and how I can meet everyone's needs for information on this period of history. Last but not least, I want to note that the maps were sourced from the West Point Atlas of the Napoleonic Wars, while all the photos were sourced from Wikimedia Commons. So thank you, and soon, part two of the Austrian invasion of Bavaria will come to you. Thank you.